When I called my son Marcus 3 hours later, still stranded in my wheelchair at Westfield Shopping Center while my phone battery died, he said, "Mom, we got busy with the kids. Can't you just call an Uber?" That evening, sitting alone in my apartment after a stranger had to help me get home, I made a single phone call that would change everything. Within 48 hours, Marcus was crying on my doorstep, begging me to reverse the cancellation of their $15,000 European vacation that I'd secretly been funding, but by then, I'd also frozen the college funds I'd been contributing to, suspended the monthly allowance I'd been sending them, and canceled the credit cards I'd been paying for. Now Jessica wishes she'd never heard the words, "We'll be right." Back, Marcus regrets choosing his wife's shopping schedule over his mother's dignity. But me? I've never felt more powerful, and I've never slept better at night. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had family members treat you like an inconvenience when you needed them most? Share your story below, because today you're going to learn that sometimes the people who abandon you are about to discover exactly how much they needed what they just threw away. This story is about the Tuesday when I learned that 5 years of financial generosity and unconditional love meant nothing when my presence became inconvenient for my son's family shopping trip. When I discovered that the child I'd raised to value family loyalty had married a woman who saw me as nothing, more than a burden to be managed around her busy schedule. My name is Eleanor Patricia Williams, and I'm 70 years old. For the past 3 years, I'd been living independently in a senior apartment complex called Sunset Gardens in Phoenix, Arizona, about 20 minutes from my son Marcus and his family. The arrangement had seemed perfect when I'd first moved from my longtime home in Denver after my husband Robert's passing. I could maintain my independence while being close enough to help with my grandchildren, 12-year-old Sophia and 9-year-old Dylan, and be part of their daily lives in whatever way felt natural. But let me tell you about the life I built before I became the inconvenient grandmother who could be abandoned at shopping malls when my presence became tiresome. I was born Eleanor Patricia O'Brien in 1954, the daughter of an Irish Catholic family in Boston, who believed that hard work, education, and taking care of family were the 3 pillars of a meaningful life. My father Patrick worked as a foreman at the Boston Harbor shipyard, while my mother Catherine managed our household of 6 children with the kind of efficiency that would make a military general proud. I met my husband Robert Williams when I was 24 and working as a bank teller at First National Bank of Boston. Robert was 27, a mechanical engineer with dreams of moving west and building something meaningful in the growing technology sector. He was kind, ambitious, and had the rare quality of seeing potential in people and situations that others might overlook. When he proposed after 2 years of courtship, he painted a picture of a life together that would honor both our families' values while building something new and exciting. We married in a beautiful ceremony at St. Joseph's Cathedral in 1978, with both our families' blessings and hopes for grandchildren who would grow up with opportunities neither of our generations had enjoyed. For the first 3 years of our marriage, we lived in a small apartment in Cambridge while Robert worked for an engineering firm, and I continued at the bank, saving every penny we could for the move west that Robert had been planning since before we met. Marcus was born on a sunny April morning in 1981, after we'd been trying for children for 2 years. When I held him for the first time, seeing Robert's gentle eyes and my own stubborn chin, I thought I understood what all our planning and sacrifice had been leading toward. He was perfect, healthy, alert, with a disposition that seemed to blend Robert's methodical thinking with my own determination to see the best in every situation. When Marcus was 18 months old, Robert received an offer from a growing electronics company in Phoenix, Arizona. The salary was substantial, the opportunity for advancement was significant, and the cost of living would allow us to buy our first home and build the kind of stable family life we'd both dreamed of creating. The decision to leave Boston wasn't easy. It meant leaving both our extended families and the community where we'd both grown up. But we were young, optimistic, and convinced that building something new together was worth the sacrifice of familiar comfort. Phoenix in 1982 was a city in transition, growing rapidly as technology companies and retirees discovered the appeal of year-round sunshine and relatively affordable living. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a new development called Desert Bloom, where young families with children were creating the kind of neighborhood community that felt like a modern version of the close-knit Boston neighborhoods we'd left behind. For the next 20 years, Robert and I built the kind of life that represented everything we'd hoped for when we'd made the decision to leave Boston. Robert's career flourished as he moved from project engineer to department manager to eventually becoming vice president of operations for Phoenix Electronics Solutions, a mid-sized company that manufactured components for the growing computer industry. I found work as an administrative coordinator for the Scottsdale School District, which allowed me to maintain my career while having a schedule that aligned with Marcus's educational needs. Marcus thrived in Arizona. He was an excellent student, a natural athlete who excelled at baseball and tennis, and had inherited his father's methodical approach to problem-solving combined with my ability to connect with people from all backgrounds. He was popular without being arrogant, successful without being competitive with his friends, and had the kind of character that made other parents comment about what a good kid the Williams family had raised. During Marcus's high school years, Robert and I began planning for what we called our second chapter, the phase of life when Marcus would be launched into adulthood, and we could focus on travel, hobbies, and the kind of relaxed enjoyment that comes after decades of focused work and parenting. We'd paid off our mortgage early, built substantial savings, and were looking forward to grandchildren who would benefit from the financial security we'd created through careful planning and consistent effort. When Marcus graduated from high school, as salutatorian and received a full academic scholarship to Arizona State University's business program, Robert and I felt like all our sacrifices and planning had been validated. We were proud parents who'd raised a son capable of building on the foundation we'd provided while creating his own version of success and happiness. During Marcus's sophomore year at ASU, he met Jessica Rodriguez, a psychology major from a wealthy Scottsdale family who owned a chain of upscale restaurants throughout the Southwest. Jessica was beautiful, intelligent, and came from the kind of established Arizona family that could provide Marcus with social and professional connections that would enhance whatever career path he chose to pursue. When Marcus brought Jessica home for the first time, I was immediately impressed by her poise, her intelligence, and her apparent genuine affection for my son. She seemed interested in our family history, asked thoughtful questions about our move from Boston, and expressed appreciation for the values that had shaped Marcus's character. During that first dinner, Jessica had said something that I'd treasured. "I can see where Marcus gets his kindness and his work ethic. You and Mr. Williams have raised someone really special." The wedding took place 3 years later at the prestigious Arizona Biltmore Resort with 200 guests, flowers that cost more than Robert and I had spent on our entire wedding, and a reception that was featured in Phoenix Magazine's society pages. I was proud to be the mother of the groom, grateful that Marcus had found love with someone who clearly adored him, and who came from a family that would support his ambitions and help him build the kind of life he deserved. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to certain details during the wedding planning process. Jessica's family dominated the guest list, filling 3/4 of the venue with their extensive social and business networks, while Marcus's side included Robert and me, a few college friends, some co-workers from his first job at a Phoenix marketing firm, and several empty tables that highlighted the difference in our social circles compared to the Rodriguez family's extensive connections. During the reception, Jessica's mother, Carmen, had introduced me to other guests as Marcus's mother, the school district administrator, while she introduced her own family and friends with detailed descriptions of their business achievements, social positions, and community involvement. The introductions weren't intentionally dismissive, but they reflected a subtle hierarchy that positioned the Williams family as Marcus's past, while the Rodriguez family represented his future. I should have noticed that when Jessica talked about their future plans, those plans centered around building their social and professional network within Phoenix's established business community, with little consideration for maintaining close relationships with extended family members who didn't contribute to those networking goals. But I was happy for Marcus, grateful that he'd found love, and optimistic that Jessica would come to appreciate the close family relationships that had always been central to the Williams family culture. I thought time and familiarity would help Jessica understand that loving Marcus meant embracing the people who'd shaped him, not just the version of him that fit into her social aspirations. The first few years of their marriage seemed to confirm my optimism. Jessica was warm and inclusive, inviting Robert and me to family celebrations and holiday gatherings. When Sophia was born 2 years after the wedding, Jessica seemed genuinely grateful for my help during those difficult first months when sleep deprivation and new parent anxiety made every day feel like an endurance test. I spent countless hours rocking Sophia when she had colic, preparing meals for the exhausted new parents, and providing the kind of practical support that made new parenthood manageable. When Dylan arrived 3 years later, the pattern repeated, with me serving as the reliable grandmother who could be counted on for emergency babysitting, meal preparation, and hands-on assistance that allowed Jessica to maintain her part-time work as a family counselor while adjusting to life with 2 young children. "Eleanor, you're a godsend," Jessica had said repeatedly during those early parenting years. I don't know how families manage without having experienced grandparents nearby to help with situations like this. At the time, I'd interpreted these expressions of gratitude as evidence that my presence was valued and that my contributions were making a meaningful difference in their quality of life. What I hadn't recognized was that Jessica's appreciation was focused on my usefulness during crisis periods, rather than my value as a permanent part of their family structure. The distinction became clear when both children were school-aged and my intensive childcare assistance was no longer needed on a daily basis. Instead of the continued gratitude and inclusion I'd expected after years of significant support, I found that Jessica's appreciation seemed to decrease as my utility diminished. Robert's death 5 years ago had changed everything about my situation and my relationship with Marcus's family. Robert had been my partner, my best friend, and my buffer in social situations where I felt uncertain about family dynamics or social expectations. When he passed away suddenly from a heart attack at age 67, I lost not just my husband, but also my primary source of emotional support and my strongest advocate within our family structure. The grief was overwhelming, but Marcus and Jessica had been wonderfully supportive during those first difficult months. They'd helped with funeral arrangements, assisted with legal and financial paperwork, and had included me in family activities in ways that made me feel like I was still part of a loving, connected family unit, even without Robert's presence. When I'd decided to sell the family home in Desert Bloom, the house held too many memories, and maintaining it alone felt overwhelming. Marcus had suggested that I consider moving closer to their family rather than staying isolated in a house that was too large and too filled with reminders of my loss. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone during this transition," Marcus had said as we'd discussed my housing options. "Phoenix has some beautiful senior communities where you could have your own space, but also access to social activities and support services. And being closer to us would mean you could be part of Sophia and Dylan's daily lives in whatever way feels comfortable." The suggestion had seemed like a natural solution to everyone's concerns about my adjustment to widowhood. I could maintain my independence while being close enough that Marcus wouldn't worry about my isolation, and Sophia and Dylan could have regular access to their grandmother during these important formative years. Sunset Gardens had seemed perfect when Marcus and Jessica had toured it with me. The apartment was spacious and comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a balcony overlooking the community's beautifully landscaped courtyard. The complex offered social activities, transportation services for shopping and appointments, and the kind of security that would give Marcus peace of mind about my safety and well-being. Most importantly, The location was only 20 minutes from Marcus and Jessica's home in the upscale Ahwatukee neighborhood, close enough for regular visits and family involvement, but far enough that I wouldn't be interfering with their daily routines or privacy. The sale of my Desert Bloom house had netted $285,000 after paying off the small remaining mortgage and covering real estate fees. Instead of keeping all that money for my own future needs, I'd given $120,000 to Marcus and Jessica as what I'd called an early inheritance to help them pay off their mortgage and fund some home improvements they'd been planning. The remaining $165,000 I'd kept in savings and investment accounts to cover my living expenses at Sunset Gardens and provide financial security for my remaining years. At the time, giving Marcus and Jessica the majority of my house sale proceeds had seemed like a generous way to help secure their family's financial future, while ensuring that I wouldn't be seen as a financial burden on their household. Marcus had been grateful, Jessica had been gracious, and I'd felt good about contributing to the beautiful home where I would spend time with my grandchildren and be part of their family celebrations. What I didn't understand was that my financial contribution would eventually be reframed as my choice, rather than acknowledged as the generous gift that had made their comfortable lifestyle possible. What I didn't anticipate was that Jessica would begin to see my presence in their lives as an obligation they'd inherited, rather than a blessing they'd chosen to embrace. For the first year after moving to Sunset Gardens, the arrangement had worked exactly as Marcus had promised. I maintained my independence while being available to help with Sophia and Dylan when needed. I contributed to family celebrations, provided occasional babysitting that allowed Marcus and Jessica to have date nights, and enjoyed the kind of grandmother role that enriched everyone's lives without creating burden or obligation. But somewhere during the second year, my helpfulness had transformed from appreciated contribution to expected service. The thank yous had become less frequent. The consideration for my own schedule and preferences had become non-existent. The assumption that I would be available whenever needed had become absolute, while the reciprocal consideration for my own needs and limitations had disappeared entirely. Jessica had begun making plans that assumed my availability without consulting me first. Date nights were scheduled with the expectation that I would provide childcare, even when I had my own social activities or appointments planned. Shopping trips and errands were organized around Jessica's schedule, with my transportation needs treated as an afterthought that could be managed with last-minute arrangements. Most telling of all, Jessica had begun making comments about my living situation that suggested she was already anticipating changes to our current arrangement. Comments about how independent I was becoming, observations about how well I was adjusting to life at Sunset Gardens, and casual mentions of friends whose elderly parents had thrived after moving to higher care facilities that provided more appropriate levels of social interaction and support. I'd told myself that these comments were just Jessica thinking out loud about future possibilities, normal concerns that any daughter-in-law might have about long-term care planning. For aging parents, I'd told myself that the increasing expectations and decreasing appreciation were temporary adjustments that would improve once everyone settled into a more comfortable routine. But looking back now, I can see that every interaction over the past year had been colored by Jessica's growing view of me as a convenience, rather than a person deserving of consideration and respect. Every casual request for babysitting had been presented as an opportunity for me to spend time with my grandchildren, rather than acknowledged as a favor that deserved appreciation. Every expectation of my availability had been framed as natural family obligation, rather than recognized as a choice I was making to prioritize their needs over my own preferences. The most insidious aspect of this gradual transformation had been how it had affected my relationship with Marcus. Because Jessica's manipulation was subtle and was always framed as concern for family harmony rather than self-serving convenience, Marcus had never recognized it as problematic behavior that required his intervention. Instead, Marcus had gradually adopted Jessica's perspective that my desires for consideration and respect were unreasonable expectations rather than normal human needs that deserved acknowledgement. When I'd mentioned feeling taken for granted, Marcus had responded with reassurances about how much the family valued me, but without any recognition that their behavior might need to change, rather than my expectations needing adjustment. The pattern had reached its most obvious expression 6 months ago, when Sophia had been invited to a classmate's birthday party at a trampoline park. The party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon when I'd planned to attend a book club meeting at Sunset Gardens, one of the few social activities I'd maintained that provided me with companionship and intellectual stimulation outside of my family relationships. When Jessica had called to ask if I could drive Sophia to the party because something had come up with her own schedule, I'd explained that I had my own commitment that afternoon and suggested that Sophia could miss this particular party or that Jessica could rearrange her plans to accommodate her daughter's social event. Jessica's response had been immediate and revealing. "Eleanor, I thought you'd want to prioritize spending time with Sophia over sitting around talking about books with people you barely know." The casual dismissal of my social relationships and personal interests had been shocking, but even more disturbing had been the underlying assumption that my time and energy belonged to their family rather than to me. That my desire to maintain friendships and intellectual stimulation was somehow selfish when it conflicted with their convenience. When I'd brought this incident to Marcus's attention, his response had been predictably disappointing. "Mom, I think Jessica was just stressed about her schedule conflict. She probably didn't mean to sound dismissive of your activities." But Jessica had meant to sound dismissive. She'd meant to establish that my personal interests were less important than their family needs, and that my role in their lives was to be available when convenient rather than to maintain my own independent social identity. That conversation had been a turning point in my understanding of how my relationship with Marcus and Jessica had evolved since Robert's death. Without Robert's presence to balance family dynamics and advocate for my needs, I'd gradually been repositioned from valued family member to useful resource whose primary function was to provide services when requested. The wheelchair situation had developed 3 months ago after I'd fallen in my apartment and fractured my ankle. The injury wasn't serious, but it required a temporary period of limited mobility while the bone healed and I completed physical therapy. My doctor had recommended using a wheelchair for longer outings to avoid fatigue and prevent re-injury during the healing process. I'd expected this temporary mobility limitation to increase my family's consideration for my needs and circumstances. Instead, it had seemed to accelerate Jessica's view of me as a burden that required management rather than a person who deserved accommodation and respect. Shopping trips that had previously been planned around my preferences and energy levels were now organized around Jessica's schedule, with my wheelchair treated as an inconvenience that slowed down their efficient completion of errands. Family outings were restructured to minimize the complications of wheelchair accessibility, often resulting in my exclusion from activities I would have enjoyed and could have participated in with minor adjustments. Most insulting of all, Jessica had begun making decisions about my participation in activities without consulting me, then presenting those decisions as considerations for my comfort and safety. Birthday parties became too crowded for wheelchair navigation. Restaurant choices were limited to places Jessica deemed appropriate for my mobility needs. Even family gatherings at their home were subtly restructured to minimize the disruption of accommodating my wheelchair. The language Jessica used when discussing my temporary disability had been particularly revealing. She consistently referred to my wheelchair as Eleanor's situation or the mobility issue, as if my medical needs were a problem that required management rather than a temporary condition that deserved accommodation and support. But what had hurt most wasn't Jessica's obvious impatience with my mobility limitations. It was Marcus's passive acceptance of his wife's attitude and his failure to advocate for his mother's dignity and inclusion. The son I'd raised to value family loyalty and compassion had gradually adopted his wife's view of me as a burden rather than defending the woman who'd sacrificed decades of her life to ensure his success and happiness. This morning's abandonment at Westfield Shopping Center hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment. It had been the inevitable result of months of systematic devaluation of my worth and dignity. Jessica had finally moved from subtle exclusion to overt abandonment, confident that Marcus would support her convenience over his mother's well-being. But what neither Jessica nor Marcus had anticipated was that the woman they'd been treating as a helpless burden actually possessed the financial resources and determination to remind them exactly how much power they'd been taking for granted. What they didn't know, as I sat alone in that mall food court watching my phone battery die, while families around me enjoyed their time together, was that I'd been making very different phone calls over the past few weeks. Calls to financial institutions, travel agencies, and legal advisors who were about to help me demonstrate the difference between being dependent and being generous. Tomorrow, Jessica and Marcus would discover that there's a significant distinction between supporting someone who needs help and exploiting someone who chooses to be helpful. Tomorrow, they would learn that abandoning someone in a wheelchair might provide temporary convenience, but it could also trigger consequences they'd never imagined possible. Tomorrow, the power dynamic in our family would be permanently reversed, and the grandmother they'd left stranded at a shopping mall would become the person who controlled whether their dreams became reality or their comfortable lifestyle became a memory. But tonight, I was just a 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair, sitting alone in my apartment, planning the phone call that would change everything. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, I want you to do something important. Hit that subscribe button, right now, because what you're about to hear is going to make you rethink everything you know about family dynamics and the power of financial independence. And while you're at it, ring that notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to stories that prove age is not a limitation. It's an accumulation of wisdom, resources, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of life experience. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about this question. Have you ever been treated like an inconvenience by the very people you've sacrificed the most for? Have you ever found yourself questioning whether your generosity was actually enabling people to take you for granted? Have you ever wondered what would happen if you simply stopped being available for people who only value you when it's convenient for them? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I read every single one, and your experiences matter. This isn't just entertainment. This is a masterclass in recognizing when kindness becomes exploitation, and more importantly, how to reclaim your power when family members mistake your love for weakness. You see, Eleanor's story isn't just about one afternoon at a shopping mall. It's about a pattern that plays out in families across the world every single day. It's about the subtle transformation that happens when your contributions become expectations, when your presence becomes conditional, and when your value as a person gets reduced to your utility as a service provider. But here's what makes Eleanor's story different from the countless other stories of family exploitation that never get resolved. Eleanor understood something that most people in her situation never figure out. She understood that respect isn't something you can beg for or negotiate. It's something you have to require. And sometimes, requiring respect means demonstrating exactly what life looks like when people lose access to the benefits they've been taking for granted. Today's story is going to challenge some deeply held beliefs about family obligation and unconditional love. We're going to explore the difference between being supportive and being exploited, between being generous and being taken advantage of, between maintaining family harmony and enabling family dysfunction. And if you're someone who's currently in a situation where your kindness is being mistaken for weakness, where your availability is being assumed rather than appreciated, where your financial support is being treated as entitlement rather than gift, then Eleanor's story is going to show you exactly how to turn that dynamic around. But I want to be clear about something before we continue. This isn't about encouraging family conflict or promoting revenge as a solution to relationship problems. This is about understanding that healthy relationships require mutual respect, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are exploiting your kindness is to stop enabling their behavior by removing the benefits they've been taking for granted. Eleanor's transformation from abandoned grandmother to powerful matriarch didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. It happened because she reached a point where preserving her dignity became more important than preserving an artificial peace. It happened because she finally understood that being treated with respect wasn't a privilege she had to earn. It was a requirement she had the right to enforce. The phone call Eleanor made that Tuesday evening wasn't made in anger, though she had every right to be furious. It wasn't made in desperation, though she'd been abandoned in one of the most vulnerable situations imaginable. It was made with the kind of cold, calculated precision that comes from finally understanding exactly how much power you've been giving away and making the decision to take it back. You see, while Marcus and Jessica had been busy reorganizing their lives around their own convenience, treating Eleanor's presence as optional and her contributions as automatic, Eleanor had been doing something they never expected. She'd been paying attention. She'd been taking notes. And most importantly, she'd been preparing for the day when their casual cruelty would finally cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That day had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon at Westfield Shopping Center when a 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair discovered that the family she'd sacrificed decades to support had finally revealed exactly how little her dignity meant to them. But what Marcus and Jessica didn't understand, as they went about their day after abandoning Eleanor at that mall, was that they'd just triggered a response from someone who'd spent 30 years in the business world, someone who understood contracts and financial leverage, someone who'd been managing money and relationships long before they were born. They'd awakened something in Eleanor that they'd never seen before, because she'd never needed to use it. They'd pushed someone who'd spent her entire life prioritizing other people's comfort to the point where she finally decided to prioritize her own power. And the beautiful thing about Eleanor's story, the thing that makes it so satisfying and so instructive, is that everything she did in response to their abandonment was completely legal, completely ethical, and completely within her rights as an independent adult who'd been freely choosing to support their lifestyle. The difference was that she stopped choosing to do it. The European vacation that Marcus and Jessica had been planning for months, Eleanor had been quietly funding it through monthly transfers to their vacation savings account, the same way she'd been contributing to countless other aspects of their comfortable lifestyle. The college funds for Sophia and Dylan that Marcus and Jessica assumed would continue growing until the children reached 18. Eleanor had been making quarterly contributions that significantly exceeded what Marcus and Jessica were contributing themselves. The credit cards that Jessica used for shopping trips and restaurant meals, the ones that allowed her to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, Eleanor had been paying those bills, treating them as a way to help her son's family avoid financial stress while building their future. All of these financial arrangements had been Eleanor's choice, made from a place of love and a desire to help her family build the kind of life she'd always dreamed they could have. But they'd never been obligations, contracts, or requirements that Eleanor had to continue regardless of how she was treated. Marcus and Jessica had made the fundamental mistake of confusing Eleanor's generosity with their entitlement. They'd forgotten that every benefit they'd been receiving from her was something she was choosing to provide, not something they had a right to demand. That Tuesday evening, sitting alone in her apartment after being abandoned at a shopping mall, Eleanor finally decided to stop choosing to provide those benefits to people who demonstrated they didn't value the person providing them. The phone call she made wasn't to a lawyer, though she'd consulted with legal advisors to ensure everything she was planning was completely above board. It wasn't to a financial planner, though she'd worked with experts to organize her assets in ways that maximized her control and minimized their access. The phone call was to her bank, to begin implementing a plan she'd been developing for weeks, as she'd watched the pattern of disrespect and casual cruelty escalate to levels that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. Within 48 hours, Marcus and Jessica would discover that the comfortable lifestyle they'd been taking for granted was actually far more fragile than they'd realized. They would learn that the financial security they'd assumed was permanent was actually dependent on maintaining a relationship with someone they'd been treating as dispensable. Most importantly, they would understand that the grandmother they'd left stranded in a wheelchair at a shopping mall was actually the person who controlled whether their dreams came true or their plans fell apart. But before we get to that moment of reckoning, before we see Marcus crying on Eleanor's doorstep and Jessica frantically trying to undo months of casual cruelty, we need to understand how Eleanor got to the point where she was capable of that kind of decisive action. We need to go back to the beginning to understand the foundation of strength and independence that Eleanor had built long before she became a grandmother, long before she moved to Phoenix, long before she found herself in a wheelchair being abandoned by people who should have been protecting her. Because Eleanor's power didn't come from anger or revenge. It came from a lifetime of understanding that respect is earned through behavior, that love is demonstrated through actions, and that family relationships, like all relationships, have to be based on mutual consideration rather than one-sided exploitation. The woman who made that phone call Tuesday evening wasn't the helpless victim that Marcus and Jessica had been treating her as. She was a woman who'd built a life, raised a family, survived loss, and maintained her independence through decades of challenges that had taught her exactly how strong she really was. She was a woman who'd finally decided that preserving other people's comfort was less important than preserving her own dignity. She was a woman who'd reached the point where teaching her family a lesson about respect had become more important than enabling their disrespectful behavior. And she was a woman who'd realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are taking you for granted is to stop being available for them to take for granted. So grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and prepare to hear about how a 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair turned the tables on family members who thought they could treat her however they wanted without consequences. Prepare to learn how Eleanor Williams transformed from abandoned grandmother to powerful matriarch in less than 48 hours, and prepare to discover that age isn't a limitation. It's an accumulation of resources, relationships, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of experience dealing with people who mistake kindness for weakness. Because Eleanor's story is about to show you exactly what happens when someone who's been underestimated finally decides to demonstrate their true power. The lesson here isn't just about family dynamics or financial control. It's about understanding that you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept, and that sometimes the biggest gift you can give someone is the consequence of their own behavior. Eleanor's story begins in Boston in 1954, but the part that changes everything starts on a Tuesday evening in Phoenix in 2024, when a woman who'd spent her entire life putting other people first finally decided it was time to put herself first. And once you hear how that decision played out, you'll never look at family obligations, financial independence, or the power of strategic thinking the same way again. So make sure you're subscribed, because this story is going to take some turns that will surprise you, inspire you, and possibly change how you handle the difficult people in your own life. Eleanor Williams was about to teach her family a lesson they'd never forget. And in the process, she was going to teach all of us something about the difference between being taken advantage of and being truly powerful. The transformation starts now. My name is Eleanor Patricia Williams, and I'm 70 years old. For the past 3 years, I'd been living independently in a senior apartment complex called Sunset Gardens in Phoenix, Arizona, about 20 minutes from my son Marcus and his family. The arrangement had seemed perfect when I'd first moved from my longtime home in Denver after my husband Robert's passing. I could maintain my independence while being close enough to help with my grandchildren, 12-year-old Sophia and 9-year-old Dylan, and be part of their daily lives in whatever way felt natural. But let me tell you about the life I built before I became the inconvenient grandmother who could be abandoned at shopping malls when my presence became tiresome. I was born Eleanor Patricia O'Brien in 1954, the daughter of an Irish Catholic family in Boston who believed that hard work, education, and taking care of family were the three pillars of a meaningful life. My father, Patrick, worked as a foreman at the Boston Harbor shipyard, while my mother, Catherine, managed our household of 6 children with the kind of efficiency that would make a military general proud. Growing up in a working-class Boston neighborhood, in the 1960s and 70s taught me lessons that would serve me well throughout my life, though I didn't understand their value at the time. We lived in a 3-story house that my father had purchased with savings from 15 years of shipyard work, a house that represented everything my parents had sacrificed to provide for their children's futures. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but in the way that creates community rather than intrusion. Mrs. Flanagan next door would watch us children when my mother had to work late cleaning houses for the wealthy families on Beacon Hill. Mr. Kowalski across the street would help my father with home repairs in exchange for my father's assistance with electrical work at the small grocery store Mr. Kowalski owned downtown. It was a world where favors were exchanged without keeping score, where children were raised by the entire community, and where reputation was built through consistency and reliability rather than wealth or social connections. But it was also a world where money was always scarce, where opportunities had to be earned through merit rather than inheritance, and where planning for the future required careful saving and strategic thinking about education and career choices. My parents had immigrated from County Cork in Ireland during the 1940s, arriving in Boston with nothing but determination and a work ethic that would eventually allow them to purchase that 3-story house and send all 6 of their children to college. They'd met at a community dance for Irish immigrants, married after a courtship that lasted 2 years, while they both saved money and established themselves in their new country. Patrick O'Brien had found work at the Boston Harbor shipyard within a month of arriving in America, starting as a general laborer and working his way up to foreman through 15 years of showing up early, staying late, and treating every task as an opportunity to prove his value to supervisors who were initially skeptical about hiring recent immigrants. Catherine O'Brien had taken work as a domestic servant for wealthy families in the Back Bay area, cleaning houses and caring for children while learning English and observing how successful American families managed their households and raised their children. She'd saved every penny she could from her wages, living in a boarding house for Irish women and wearing the same 3 dresses for 2 years, while accumulating the money that would eventually become the down payment on the house where I grew up. By the time I was old enough to understand adult conversations, my parents had achieved a level of financial security that allowed them to focus on their children's education and future opportunities rather than basic survival. But they never forgot the lessons they'd learned during those early years of struggle, and they made sure their children understood that security was something that had to be earned and protected through careful planning and consistent effort. Eleanor, my father would say when I complained about having to work part-time jobs during high school, money that you earn yourself is money that no one can take away from you, but money that you depend on other people to provide can disappear as quickly as it appeared. That lesson, that financial independence was the foundation of all other forms of independence, would shape every major decision I made throughout my adult life. It would influence my choice to continue working even after Marcus was born. My insistence on maintaining my own savings account, even during the years when Robert's income could have supported our entire family, and my careful planning for retirement, that had allowed me to maintain my dignity and independence even after Robert's death. My mother's lessons were equally important, though focused more on relationships and family dynamics than money management. Catherine O'Brien had observed wealthy families long enough to understand that money alone didn't create happiness or security, and that the families who thrived over generations were those who maintained strong relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care for each other's well-being. Eleanor, she would tell me as I helped her prepare dinner each evening. Money can solve many problems, but it cannot solve the problem of people who don't love each other properly. The families I work for who are truly happy are the ones where everyone treats everyone else with kindness and consideration, regardless of who earns the money or who makes the decisions. That lesson, that respect and consideration were the foundation of healthy relationships, would become the standard by which I measured all my important relationships throughout my life. It would guide my expectations for marriage, my approach to raising Marcus, and eventually, my recognition of when family relationships had become unhealthy enough to require intervention. I met my husband Robert Williams when I was 24 and working as a bank teller at First National Bank of Boston. Robert was 27, a mechanical engineer with dreams of moving west and building something meaningful in the growing technology sector. He was kind, ambitious, and had the rare quality of seeing potential in people and situations that others might overlook. What attracted me to Robert wasn't just his intelligence or his ambition, though both were impressive. What drew me to him was the way he listened when I talked about my family, my work, and my own dreams for the future. He was genuinely interested in my opinions about things that mattered to both of us, and he treated my goals and preferences as equally important to his own when we discussed the kind of life we might build together. During our 2-year courtship, Robert had demonstrated the qualities that would make him not just a good husband, but a true partner in building the kind of life that would honor both our family's sacrifices and our own dreams for the future. He was the kind of man who remembered what I'd told him about my family's history and my parents' struggles, and who understood that my commitment to financial independence wasn't distrust of his ability to provide for our family, but rather a reflection of values that had been shaped by my parents' experiences as immigrants who'd had to build security from nothing. When Robert proposed in February 1978, he did so with a speech that had convinced me he understood not just what I wanted from marriage, but why those things were important to me. "Eleanor," he had said, "I want to build something with you that our children will be proud to inherit, not just in terms of money or property, but in terms of the values and the love that will be the foundation of everything we create together." We married at St. Joseph's Cathedral in Boston in a ceremony that represented everything hopeful about young love and careful planning. The wedding wasn't elaborate by today's standards, but it was perfect in the way that matters most. It was a celebration of two people who genuinely understood what they were promising each other and had the character to honor those promises through whatever challenges life might bring. The early years of our marriage had been challenging in the way that builds character rather than destroying it. Robert's job as a junior engineer at Morrison & Associates provided a steady but modest income, while my position at First National Bank contributed enough to allow us to save for the future we were planning. We lived carefully, spending money on experiences and investments that would build our foundation rather than on luxuries that would provide temporary pleasure but no lasting value. But what made those early years special wasn't the financial, discipline, or the practical skills we were developing. It was the way we approached every decision as a team, with each person's opinions and preferences given equal weight in creating the life we were building together. When Marcus was born, in 1981, Robert and I were ready for parenthood in all the ways that mattered. We had established ourselves financially, we had created a stable home environment, and we had developed the kind of partnership that would allow us to raise a child with consistent values and expectations, while also giving him the love and attention. He would need to develop his own personality and interests. But even before Marcus was born, Robert and I had been planning for the move west that would eventually take us to Phoenix. Robert had been offered a position with Phoenix Electronics Solutions, a growing company that manufactured components for the emerging personal computer industry. The opportunity represented everything we'd been working toward, a chance for Robert to advance his career while building the kind of financial security that would allow us to provide Marcus with opportunities neither of us had enjoyed during our own childhoods. The decision to leave Boston wasn't easy. It meant leaving both our extended families and the community connections that had provided security and familiarity throughout our young adult years. But Robert and I had spent months researching the opportunity and developing a plan that would allow us to pursue our professional goals while building the kind of family life that honored both our values about community, stability, and putting family relationships first. When we moved to Phoenix in 1982, Marcus was 18 months old, and I was pregnant with the hopes and dreams that would shape the next 20 years of our lives. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a new development called Desert Bloom, where young families with children were creating the kind of neighborhood community that felt like a modern version of the close-knit Boston neighborhoods we'd left. Behind Phoenix in 1982 was a city in transition, growing rapidly as technology companies and retirees discovered the appeal of year-round sunshine and relatively affordable living. Robert's career flourished as he moved from project engineer to department manager, to eventually becoming vice president of operations for Phoenix Electronic Solutions. I found work as an administrative coordinator for the Scottsdale School District, which allowed me to maintain my career while having a schedule that aligned with Marcus's educational needs. For the next 20 years, Robert and I built the kind of life that represented everything we'd hoped for when we'd made the decision to leave Boston. We paid off our mortgage early, built substantial savings, and created the kind of stable, loving home environment where Marcus could develop his own personality and interests while being shaped by values that would serve him well throughout his life. Marcus thrived in Arizona. He was an excellent student, a natural athlete who excelled at baseball and tennis, and had inherited his father's methodical approach to problem-solving, combined with my ability to connect with people from all backgrounds. He was popular without being arrogant, successful without being competitive with his friends, and had the kind of character that made other parents comment about what a good kid the Williams family had raised. When Marcus graduated from high school as salutatorian and received a full academic scholarship to Arizona State University's business program, Robert and I felt like all our sacrifices and planning had been validated. We were proud parents who'd raised a son capable of building on the foundation we'd provided while creating his own version of success and happiness. During Marcus's sophomore year at ASU, he met Jessica Rodriguez, a psychology major from a wealthy Scottsdale family who owned a chain of upscale restaurants throughout the Southwest. Jessica was beautiful, intelligent, and came from the kind of established Arizona family that could provide Marcus with social and professional connections that would enhance whatever career path he chose to pursue. When Marcus brought Jessica home for the first time, I was immediately impressed by her poise, her intelligence, and her apparent genuine affection for my son. She seemed interested in our family history, asked thoughtful questions about our move from Boston, and expressed appreciation for the values that had shaped Marcus's character. "I can see where Marcus gets his kindness and his work ethic," Jessica had said during that first dinner. "You and Mr. Williams have raised someone really special." At the time, I'd treasured that comment as evidence that Jessica understood and valued what Robert and I had tried to accomplish as parents. Looking back now, I can see that Jessica was already demonstrating the skill she would later use to manipulate family dynamics, the ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear while privately calculating how their relationships could be used to advance her own interests. The wedding took place 3 years later at the prestigious Arizona Biltmore Resort, with 200 guests, flowers that cost more than Robert and I had spent on our entire wedding, and a reception that was featured in Phoenix Magazine's society pages. I was proud to be the mother of the groom, grateful that Marcus had found love with someone who clearly adored him and who came from a family that would support his ambitions and help him build the kind of life he deserved. But even during the wedding planning process, there had been signs that I should have recognized as warnings about how Jessica viewed family relationships and social dynamics. Jessica's family had dominated the guest list, filling 3/4 of the venue with their extensive social and business networks, while Marcus's side had included Robert and me, a few college friends, some co-workers from his first job at a Phoenix marketing firm. and several empty tables that highlighted the difference in our social circles compared to the Rodriguez family's extensive connections. During the reception, Jessica's mother, Carmen, had introduced me to other guests as Marcus's mother, the school, district administrator, while she introduced her own family and friends with detailed descriptions of their business achievements, social positions, and community involvement. The introductions weren't intentionally dismissive, but they reflected a subtle hierarchy that positioned the Williams family as Marcus's past, while the Rodriguez family represented his future. I should have noticed that when Jessica talked about their future plans, those plans centered around building their social and professional network within Phoenix's established business community, with little consideration for maintaining close relationships with extended family members who didn't contribute to those networking goals. But I was happy for Marcus, grateful that he'd found love, and optimistic that Jessica would come to appreciate the close family relationships that had always been central to the Williams family culture. I thought time and familiarity would help Jessica understand that loving Marcus meant embracing the people who'd shaped him, not just the version of him that fit into her social aspirations. That optimism would sustain me through the early years of their marriage, through the births of Sophia and Dylan, through Robert's death and my move to Sunset Gardens. It would take years of systematic exclusion, casual cruelty, and deliberate dismissal before I finally understood that Jessica had never intended to embrace the Williams family values. She had always planned to replace them with Rodriguez family priorities. But on that Tuesday evening, sitting alone in my apartment after being abandoned at Westfield Shopping Center, all of that history crystallized into a single, clear understanding. The woman who'd spent 70 years building relationships based on mutual respect and consideration had finally encountered people who mistook her love for weakness, her generosity for obligation, and her availability for entitlement. That understanding would transform everything about how I approached my relationship with Marcus and Jessica. And they were about to discover that dismissing someone as irrelevant could be the biggest mistake they'd ever made. Let me take you back to 1978, when Eleanor Patricia O'Brien became Eleanor Patricia Williams in a ceremony that represented everything hopeful about young love and careful planning. The wedding at St. Joseph's Cathedral in Boston wasn't elaborate by today's standards, but it was perfect in the way that matters most. It was a celebration of two people who genuinely understood what they were promising each other and had the character to honor those promises through whatever challenges life might bring. Robert Williams was the kind of man that Eleanor's father Patrick had hoped she would find. Steady, ambitious, but not at the expense of his integrity or his commitment to family. During their 2-year courtship, Robert had demonstrated the qualities that would make him not just a good husband, but a true partner in building the kind of life that would honor both their family's sacrifices and their own dreams for the future. Eleanor, Robert had said during his proposal, I want to build something with you that our children will be proud to inherit, not just in terms of money or property, but in terms of the values and the love that will be the foundation of everything we create together. That proposal had taken place on a snowy February evening in 1978, in the small apartment they'd been sharing near Harvard Square. Robert had saved for months to buy the modest but beautiful engagement ring that Eleanor still wore every day until Robert's death 5 years ago. But what she remembered most about that evening wasn't the ring or the romantic setting. It was the way Robert had talked about their future as something they would create together, as equal partners with equal responsibility for the family they were planning to build. The early years of their marriage had been challenging in the way that builds character rather than destroying it. Robert's job as a junior engineer at Morrison & Associates provided a steady but modest income, while Eleanor's position at First National Bank contributed enough to allow them to save for the future they were planning. They lived carefully, spending money on experiences and investments that would build their foundation, rather than on luxuries that would provide temporary pleasure but no lasting value. Their small apartment in Cambridge was furnished with pieces they'd chosen together, items that were functional and beautiful, but purchased within a budget that prioritized their long-term goals over immediate gratification. Eleanor had learned to cook the kind of meals that were both nutritious and economical, while Robert had developed skills in home maintenance and repair that saved money while giving him the satisfaction of taking care of their environment with his own hands. But what made those early years special wasn't the financial discipline or the practical skills they were developing. It was the way they approached every decision as a team, with each person's opinions and preferences given equal weight in creating the life they were building together. When Robert had first mentioned his dream of moving west to pursue opportunities in the growing technology sector, Eleanor's initial reaction had been concern about leaving the family and community connections that provided security and familiarity. But instead of dismissing her concerns or pressuring her to accept his vision without question, Robert had spent months researching opportunities and developing a plan that addressed Eleanor's need for security while pursuing his professional ambitions. "I don't want you to sacrifice your happiness for my career," Robert had told her during one of their many conversations about the potential move. "But I also don't want us to limit our possibilities because we're afraid of change. Let's figure out how to make this work in a way that gives us both what we need." That approach, problem-solving together, rather than one person deciding for both, had become the foundation of their decision-making process throughout their marriage. When they'd finally decided to make the move to Phoenix, it had been because they'd found a way to pursue Robert's career goals while building the kind of family life that honored Eleanor's values about community, stability, and putting family relationships first. Marcus had been born into that kind of partnership, into a household where both parents were equally invested in his well-being, and where decisions about his upbringing were made through conversation and compromise rather than one parent imposing their will on the family structure. From his earliest days, Marcus had been surrounded by the kind of love that creates security rather than anxiety, the kind of attention that builds confidence rather than neediness, and the kind of expectations that encourage excellence without creating pressure that damages self-esteem or family relationships. Eleanor remembered Marcus as a toddler, playing in the backyard of their first Phoenix home, while she and Robert worked together on the garden they were planning. Even as a very young child, Marcus had shown the combination of independence and consideration that would characterize his personality throughout his childhood and adolescence. "Mama, can I help?" Marcus would ask when he saw Eleanor planting flowers or Robert building the raised beds that would become their vegetable garden. And both Eleanor and Robert had been committed to finding ways for Marcus to contribute meaningfully to family projects, even when including him made tasks take longer or require more supervision. Those early years in Phoenix had been everything that Eleanor and Robert had hoped for when they'd made the decision to leave Boston and build their new life in the Southwest. Robert's career had progressed steadily as Phoenix Electronics Solutions grew from a small startup into a significant player in the emerging personal computer industry. Eleanor had found fulfilling work with the Scottsdale School District, where her combination of organizational skills and genuine care for children's well-being had made her a valued member of the administrative team. But most importantly, they'd been successful in creating the kind of family environment where Marcus could develop his own personality and interests, while being shaped by values that would serve him well throughout his life. Marcus had been the kind of child that other parents noticed and admired, polite without being artificial, confident without being arrogant, capable of entertaining himself, but also genuinely interested in spending time with adults and participating in family activities. He'd excelled in school not because Eleanor and Robert had pressured him to achieve, but because they'd created an environment where learning was valued and curiosity was encouraged. During Marcus's elementary school years, Eleanor had volunteered extensively in his classroom and school activities, not because she was anxious about his performance or social adjustment, but because she genuinely enjoyed being part of the community that was helping to shape her son's character and education. She'd served on the PTA board, helped organize school fundraisers, and had been the kind of parent that teachers appreciated, involved and supportive without being demanding or interfering. Robert had been equally involved in Marcus's upbringing, coaching his little league teams, helping with science fair projects, and spending weekend time on activities that Marcus enjoyed. But what Eleanor had valued most about Robert's parenting style was the way he'd consistently treated Marcus as a person whose opinions and preferences mattered, rather than as a project to be managed or controlled. Marcus is going to have to make his own decisions about his life, Robert had said when other parents had commented on their relatively relaxed approach to scheduling and activities. Our job is to give him the tools and the values he'll need to make good decisions, not to make all his decisions for him. That philosophy had served Marcus well throughout his childhood and adolescence. He'd developed genuine interests in sports, academics, and social activities because he'd been allowed to explore what appealed to him rather than being pushed into activities that his parents thought would look good on college applications or enhance his social status. When Marcus had decided to focus on baseball during high school, Eleanor and Robert had supported his commitment to the sport while ensuring that he maintained his academic performance and his responsibilities to family and community. When he'd wanted to take a part-time job during his junior year, they'd helped him find a position that would teach him valuable skills while not interfering with his other commitments. Most importantly, throughout Marcus's adolescence, Eleanor and Robert had maintained their partnership approach to parenting, discussing decisions about rules, expectations, and consequences to ensure that they were presenting a united front while also being fair and reasonable in their expectations. The result had been a young man who graduated from high school with excellent grades, genuine friendships, and the kind of character that made adults enjoy his company and trust his judgment. Marcus had been accepted to several excellent universities, but his decision to attend Arizona State University had been based on practical considerations about finances and career preparation rather than prestige or social status. "I want to build on what you and Dad have created," Marcus had told Eleanor and Robert during his senior year of high school. "I want to study business so I can understand how to create the kind of security and opportunities for my own family that you've created for me." That statement had represented everything that Eleanor and Robert had hoped to achieve as parents. They'd raised a son who valued what they'd built together and who wanted to honor their sacrifice by building something meaningful with his own life. During Marcus's college years, Eleanor and Robert had entered what they'd always thought of as the next phase of their marriage, the time when they could focus more on their own relationship and interests while remaining available to support Marcus as he transitioned into independent adulthood. They'd traveled more during those years, taking trips to visit national parks and historical sites that they'd always wanted to see, but had postponed while Marcus's activities required their presence and attention. They'd renovated their home in Desert Bloom, updating systems and finishes that would make the house more comfortable for their retirement years, while also increasing its value as an investment for Marcus's eventual inheritance. Robert had been promoted to Vice President of Operations at Phoenix Electronics Solutions, a position that came with significant salary increases and stock options that would provide financial security for their retirement, while also allowing them to help Marcus with college expenses and his transition into independent adulthood. Eleanor had advanced to Senior Administrative Coordinator for the Scottsdale School District, a role that utilized her decades of experience while giving her the flexibility to maintain her involvement in Marcus's college activities and to pursue her own interests in community volunteer work and continuing education. But most importantly, Eleanor and Robert had maintained the kind of marriage that continued to grow stronger with time, where shared experiences and mutual support created deeper intimacy rather than the kind of familiarity that breeds indifference or resentment. "Eleanor," Robert had said on their 20th wedding anniversary, "I love you more today than I did when we got married, not because the feelings are stronger, but because I know so much more about who you really are and what you're capable of accomplishing." That anniversary celebration had taken place at the same restaurant where Robert had proposed, a small Italian place near ASU campus where they'd continued to celebrate important milestones throughout their marriage. The tradition had started accidentally. They'd gone there for dinner after one of Marcus's baseball games during his freshman year, and the owner had recognized them as regular customers and had sent over a bottle of wine to congratulate them on their son's academic scholarship. "You know," the owner had said when he'd stopped by their table, "in 30 years of running this restaurant, I can always tell which couples are going to make it for the long term. It's the ones who still talk to each other instead of just talking at each other." That observation had sparked a conversation between Eleanor and Robert about the marriages they'd observed over the years, friends and family members whose relationships had strengthened over time versus those who'd grown apart despite remaining legally married. They'd identified patterns that distinguished successful partnerships from those that simply endured, continuing to learn about each other, maintaining individual interests while building shared experiences, and treating each other with the kind of consideration they'd want to receive from their closest friends. When Marcus had met Jessica during his sophomore year at ASU, Eleanor and Robert had been cautiously optimistic about his first serious relationship. Marcus had always been selective about the people he allowed into his inner circle, and his decision to introduce Jessica to his parents after only 3 months of dating suggested that he saw potential for a long-term relationship. Jessica Rodriguez had made an impressive first impression. She was beautiful in an understated way, intelligent without being pretentious, and had demonstrated genuine interest in Marcus's family history and values. During that first dinner at Eleanor and Robert's home, Jessica had asked thoughtful questions about their move from Boston, their experiences building a life in Phoenix, and their perspectives on raising children in a rapidly changing world. "I can see where Marcus gets his kindness and his work ethic," Jessica had said as she'd helped Eleanor clear the dinner dishes. "You and Mr. Williams have raised someone really special." At the time, Eleanor had interpreted Jessica's comments as evidence of emotional intelligence and family values that would make her a good partner for Marcus. Jessica had seemed to understand that Marcus's character had been shaped by his upbringing, and her appreciation for Eleanor and Robert's parenting suggested that she would value the close family relationships that had always been central to the Williams family culture. Over the following months, as Marcus and Jessica's relationship had become more serious, Eleanor had enjoyed getting to know the young woman who might become her daughter-in-law. Jessica had been invited to family celebrations and holiday gatherings, where she'd consistently demonstrated the kind of grace and consideration that suggested she would fit well into the Williams family dynamics. When Marcus had announced their engagement during his senior year at ASU, Eleanor and Robert had been genuinely happy for the young couple. Jessica's family was well established in Phoenix's business community, with resources and connections that would provide Marcus with opportunities to build on his ASU business degree, while creating the kind of financial security that would allow him to provide for his own family. The Rodriguez family owned a chain of upscale restaurants throughout the Southwest, businesses that had been built over 2 generations and had established them as significant players in Phoenix's hospitality and entertainment industries. Jessica's father, Carlos Rodriguez, was a respected businessman who served on several nonprofit boards and had been featured in Arizona Business Magazine as one of the state's most successful entrepreneurs. Jessica's mother, Carmen Rodriguez, was equally impressive, a former teacher who had transitioned into nonprofit management and had been instrumental in developing educational programs for underserved communities throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. The Rodriguez family represented the kind of civic engagement and social responsibility that Eleanor and Robert had always valued. Most importantly, Jessica and Marcus had seemed genuinely compatible as a couple. They shared interests in outdoor activities, cultural events, and travel. They had similar goals about building a family while maintaining their individual career aspirations. And they had demonstrated the kind of mutual respect and support that Eleanor and Robert had recognized as essential for long-term relationship success. The wedding planning process had been an education in the differences between the Williams and Rodriguez family approaches to social events and financial expenditures. While Eleanor and Robert had celebrated important milestones with modest gatherings focused on family and close friends, the Rodriguez family had treated Marcus and Jessica's wedding as an opportunity to showcase their social connections and business relationships. The guest list had grown from Jessica's initial suggestion of a small ceremony with close family and friends to a reception for 200 people at the prestigious Arizona Biltmore Resort. The flowers had cost more than Eleanor and Robert had spent on their entire wedding, and the reception had featured a live band, professional photographers, and catering that had been featured in Phoenix Magazine's society pages. Eleanor had initially been concerned about the expense and elaborate planning, but Robert had helped her understand that the wedding was as much about the Rodriguez family's business relationships as it was about celebrating Marcus and Jessica's marriage. Different families have different traditions, Robert had said when Eleanor had expressed anxiety about feeling out of place at such an elaborate event. What matters is that Marcus and Jessica are building something together that honors both families' values, even if we express those values in different ways. The wedding had indeed been beautiful, and Eleanor had been proud to be the mother of the groom. Marcus had looked handsome and confident in his tuxedo, and Jessica had been radiant in a dress that had probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly salary, but had been perfect for the occasion and the setting. During the reception, Eleanor had enjoyed meeting Jessica's extended family and family friends, many of whom had been genuinely interested in learning about Marcus's background and the Williams family's history in Phoenix. Several guests had commented on Marcus's poise and character, crediting Eleanor and Robert's parenting for raising such an impressive young man. "You should be very proud," Carmen Rodriguez had said during the reception. "Marcus is exactly the kind of man we'd hoped Jessica would find. Someone with strong values and the ambition to build something meaningful with his life." At the time, Eleanor had interpreted Carmen's comments as acknowledgement that the Williams family values were respected and appreciated by the Rodriguez family. Looking back now, she could see that Carmen had been evaluating Marcus's suitability based on his potential to enhance the Rodriguez family's social and business network, rather than appreciating him as an individual with his own family heritage and values. But on that wedding day, surrounded by celebration and optimism about Marcus and Jessica's future together, Eleanor had felt confident that her son was beginning a marriage that would honor the foundation she and Robert had provided, while building something new and exciting with a partner who understood and valued what mattered most to the Williams family. The first few years of Marcus and Jessica's marriage had seemed to confirm Eleanor's optimism. Jessica had been warm and inclusive, inviting Eleanor and Robert to family celebrations and holiday gatherings. She'd seemed genuinely grateful for Eleanor's help during the early months of adjusting to married life, when managing a household while both partners were establishing their careers required the kind of support that experienced family members could provide. When Sophia had been born 2 years after the wedding, Jessica had actively sought Eleanor's advice about everything from breastfeeding and sleep schedules to managing the anxiety that came with first-time parenthood. Eleanor had spent countless hours helping with the kind of practical support that made the transition to parenthood manageable: meal preparation, laundry, and the overnight care that allowed new parents to get enough rest to function during the demanding early months. "Eleanor, I don't know what I'd do without you," Jessica had said repeatedly during Sophia's infancy. "Having an experienced mother nearby has made this so much easier than it would have been if we were trying to figure everything out on our own." At the time, Eleanor had treasured these expressions of gratitude as evidence that her presence was valued and that her contributions were making a meaningful difference in their quality of life. She'd enjoyed the role of helpful grandmother and had looked forward to years of being involved in Sophia's upbringing, while maintaining the close relationship with Marcus that had always been central to her happiness. When Dylan had arrived 3 years later, the pattern had repeated, with Eleanor providing intensive support during the challenging months of adjusting to life with 2 young children. Jessica had seemed genuinely appreciative of Eleanor's help, and Marcus had regularly expressed gratitude for his mother's willingness to prioritize their family's needs. "Mom, you're amazing," Marcus had said after Eleanor had provided emergency childcare during Dylan's bout with pneumonia when he was 6 months old. "I don't know how families manage situations like this without having experienced grandparents who can step in when everything gets overwhelming." Those early years of being Sophia and Dylan's grandmother had been some of the happiest of Eleanor's life. She'd enjoyed watching the children develop their own personalities, helping with their care and education, and maintaining the close family, relationships that had always been her greatest source of satisfaction and meaning. But somewhere during Sophia's preschool years, Eleanor had begun to notice subtle changes in how Jessica approached their family relationship. The requests for help had become less polite and more assumptive. The expressions of gratitude had become less frequent and more perfunctory. The consideration for Eleanor's own schedule and preferences had gradually diminished until it was essentially non-existent. The transformation had been so gradual that Eleanor had initially attributed it to the normal adjustments that come with the stress of managing young children while building careers. She'd told herself that Jessica's decreasing politeness was evidence of growing comfort with family relationships rather than growing disrespect for Eleanor's contributions and dignity. But as the pattern had continued and escalated over the years, Eleanor had begun to recognize that something more troubling was happening. Jessica wasn't becoming more comfortable with Eleanor as a family member. She was beginning to treat Eleanor as a service provider whose availability could be assumed rather than requested, whose contributions could be expected rather than appreciated. The most concerning aspect of this transformation had been Marcus's gradual adoption of Jessica's attitude toward his mother. Instead of maintaining the respectful, appreciative relationship that had characterized their bond throughout his childhood and young adulthood, Marcus had begun treating Eleanor's contributions as normal family obligations rather than generous choices that deserved acknowledgement and reciprocal consideration. When Eleanor had tried to address these changes directly, bringing her concerns to Marcus during private conversations, his responses had consistently minimized her feelings while making excuses for Jessica's behavior. "Mom, I think you're reading too much into these situations," Marcus had said when Eleanor had mentioned feeling taken for granted. "Jessica's just comfortable with you now. That's a good thing, not something to worry about. But comfort shouldn't eliminate consideration, and growing familiarity shouldn't reduce respect." Eleanor had begun to understand that Marcus was choosing to preserve harmony with his wife rather than address legitimate concerns about how his mother was being treated. That realization had been painful but clarifying. The son she'd raised to value family relationships above personal convenience had gradually adopted his wife's view that Eleanor's needs and feelings were less important than their own comfort and social aspirations. Robert's death, 5 years ago, had marked the beginning of Eleanor's complete vulnerability to Jessica's manipulation and control. Without Robert's presence to balance family dynamics and advocate for Eleanor's dignity, she'd found herself increasingly isolated and dependent on Marcus and Jessica's willingness to include her in their lives on terms that respected her worth as a person, rather than just her utility as a helper. The decision to sell the Desert Bloom house and move to Sunset Gardens had seemed like a natural transition that would benefit everyone involved. Eleanor would have the security and social opportunities that came with senior community living, while Marcus and Jessica would have peace of mind about her safety and well-being without the daily responsibility of managing her needs. But what Eleanor hadn't anticipated was how quickly Jessica would reframe Eleanor's presence in their lives from valued family member to burdensome obligation. The financial contribution Eleanor had made to their mortgage had been forgotten or recontextualized as Eleanor's choice, rather than acknowledged as generous support. The years of child care and household assistance had been dismissed as natural, grandmother activities rather than recognized as significant gifts of time and energy. Most devastating of all, Eleanor's temporary mobility limitations following her ankle fracture had been treated as confirmation that she was becoming a burden, rather than as a temporary challenge that deserved accommodation and support. the wheelchair that Eleanor needed. For longer outings had become, in Jessica's mind, a symbol of Eleanor's declining independence, rather than a tool that allowed her to continue participating in family activities. Instead of making minor adjustments to include Eleanor in their plans, Jessica had begun excluding Eleanor from activities while framing those exclusions as considerations for Eleanor's comfort and safety. This morning's abandonment at Westfield Shopping Center hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment. It had been the inevitable result of 3 years of systematic devaluation that had finally reached the point where Jessica felt comfortable treating Eleanor with open cruelty, rather than subtle manipulation. But what Jessica and Marcus hadn't understood, as they'd congratulated themselves on their efficient completion of shopping errands without the complication of accommodating Eleanor's wheelchair, was that they'd finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd transformed Eleanor from generous family member to abandoned burden, and in doing so, they'd triggered a response from someone who'd spent 70 years learning exactly how much power determined women could wield when they finally decided to stop prioritizing other people's comfort over their own dignity. The phone call Eleanor made that Tuesday evening wasn't made in anger, though she had every right to be furious. It wasn't made in desperation, though she'd been abandoned in one of the most vulnerable situations imaginable. It was made with the kind of cold, calculated precision that comes from finally understanding exactly how much power you've been giving away and making the decision to take it back. Within 48 hours, Marcus would be crying on Eleanor's doorstep, begging her to reconsider decisions that would transform their comfortable lifestyle into a memory. Jessica would discover that the grandmother she'd dismissed as irrelevant actually controlled whether their dreams became reality or their plans fell apart. But most importantly, Eleanor would demonstrate that respect isn't optional in family relationships. It's the price of admission to the benefits that love and generosity can provide. Sometimes the people who treat you as disposable discover too late that you were actually indispensable. Sometimes the family members who mistake your kindness for weakness learn that wisdom and resources accumulated over 70 years can be more powerful than youth and arrogance. And sometimes the best gift you can give people who take you for granted is the consequence of their own behavior. Eleanor Williams was about to teach her family a lesson they'd never forget. The golden years of their comfortable, financially secure lifestyle were about to end, and the grandmother they'd left stranded in a wheelchair was about to become the most powerful person in their world. The years immediately following Marcus and Jessica's wedding had been everything Eleanor had hoped for when she'd dreamed about becoming a grandmother. It was a time when her experience was valued, her presence was welcomed, and her contributions to their young family were treated as gifts rather than obligations. Looking back now, Eleanor could see that this golden period had lasted approximately 5 years, from Sophia's birth until Dylan was about 2 years old, before the gradual transformation began that would eventually lead to that terrible Tuesday afternoon at Westfield Shopping Center. During those early years, Jessica had approached Eleanor not as a burden to be managed, but as a resource to be treasured. The young woman who'd grown up in the Rodriguez family's world of hired help and professional services had quickly discovered that having an experienced mother figure available for guidance and support was infinitely more valuable than any paid assistance could provide. "Eleanor, I need your honest opinion about something," Jessica would say when facing decisions about Sophia's feeding schedules, sleep training, or developmental milestones. "My mother means well, but she had nannies for everything when I was little. You actually raised Marcus yourself, and look how wonderfully he turned out." These conversations had taken place in Eleanor's kitchen at the Desert Bloom house, where Jessica would arrive with Sophia in her carrier and a list of questions about everything from diaper rash remedies to introducing solid foods. Eleanor had treasured these sessions, not just because they allowed her to share knowledge she'd gained through years of hands-on parenting, but because they represented the kind of intergenerational relationship she'd always hoped to have with her daughter-in-law. Jessica's appreciation during those early years had seemed genuine and heartfelt. When Sophia had experienced colic during her first 3 months, crying inconsolably for hours each evening despite Jessica's best efforts to comfort her, Eleanor had provided the kind of practical support that made the difference between manageable stress and complete exhaustion. "I'll take the night shift tonight," Eleanor would offer when she saw Jessica reaching the breaking point after days of interrupted sleep. "You and Marcus need rest, and I remember exactly what worked with Marcus when he went through this phase." Eleanor would arrive at their house by 8 p.m., equipped with the rocking chair technique, the specific holding position, and the patience that only comes from understanding that colic is temporary, but exhaustion can damage relationships if not properly managed. She'd spend hours walking the floor with Sophia, humming lullabies that had worked with Marcus, while Jessica and Marcus slept peacefully in their bedroom. "Eleanor, you're literally saving our marriage," Jessica had said after one particularly difficult week when Sophia's crying had pushed both new parents to their emotional limits. "I don't know how people survive the first few months without experienced help." Those words had meant everything to Eleanor, not because she needed validation for her contributions, but because they suggested that Jessica understood the value of family support systems and intended to maintain the kind of close relationships that would benefit everyone involved as Sophia grew older. When Dylan was born 3 years later, the pattern had continued with even greater intensity. Jessica had been more confident as a mother by then, but managing 2 young children while maintaining her part-time counseling practice had required the kind of logistical support that only someone with extensive childcare experience could provide effectively. Eleanor had essentially moved in with Marcus and Jessica for the first month after Dylan's birth, handling Sophia's needs while Jessica recovered from delivery and adjusted to nursing a newborn. She'd managed the household routines that kept life functioning: meal preparation, laundry, errands, and the countless small tasks that become overwhelming when parents are sleep-deprived and emotionally stretched. "I don't understand how families manage without grandmothers," Jessica had said during one of their early morning conversations, while Dylan nursed and Sophia played quietly with toys Eleanor had brought from her house. "My friends with new babies are all hiring postpartum doulas and night nurses. We have something so much better. We have you." During those months, Eleanor had felt truly needed and appreciated in ways that reminded her of the satisfaction she'd found in raising Marcus. But more than that, she'd felt like she was contributing to something larger than just practical childcare. She was helping to establish the foundation of a family that would carry forward the values and traditions that had always been central to her sense of meaning and purpose. The relationship had been reciprocal in ways that Eleanor had treasured. Jessica had genuinely sought Eleanor's advice not just about childcare, but about managing the emotional challenges of new motherhood, maintaining marriage relationships during stressful transitions, and balancing personal needs with family responsibilities. "You and Robert made it look so easy," Jessica had said during one of their conversations about managing work-life balance. "How did you handle having a career while being so present for Marcus? I feel like I'm constantly choosing between being a good mother and being a good counselor." Eleanor had shared stories about her own struggles with similar decisions, the compromises she and Robert had made, and the strategies they'd developed for ensuring that Marcus felt prioritized while both parents maintained their professional identities. These conversations had felt like the kind of mentoring relationship Eleanor had always hoped to have with Marcus's wife, one where experience was valued and wisdom was passed down through family generations. But even more meaningful had been Jessica's efforts to include Eleanor in the children's daily lives in ways that went beyond emergency childcare and crisis management. Jessica had established traditions that positioned Eleanor as an integral part of Sophia and Dylan's family experience, rather than as an occasional helper who appeared when needed. Every Sunday afternoon, Jessica would bring the children to Eleanor's house for what they called grandma time, several hours when Eleanor could focus entirely on her grandchildren, while Jessica and Marcus had time for their own activities or simply rest. These sessions weren't structured around Eleanor providing childcare convenience for Marcus and Jessica. They were designed to give Sophia and Dylan individual attention from their grandmother while building the kind of close relationships that would enrich their emotional development. Sophia has been talking about making cookies with Grandma Eleanor all week, Jessica would say when dropping the children off. And Dylan can't wait to show you the new book he learned to read. Take as much time as you want with them, Marcus. And I will pick them up whenever works best for you. During these Sunday visits, Eleanor had been free to focus entirely on activities that she and the children enjoyed together. They'd baked cookies using recipes Eleanor had learned from her own mother, worked on art projects that required more patience than busy parents typically had available, and had the kind of extended conversations that allowed Eleanor to really understand her grandchildren's personalities and interests. Sophia had been a thoughtful, creative child who loved hearing stories about Eleanor's childhood in Boston and Marcus's growing up in Phoenix. She'd ask detailed questions about family history, wanting to understand how the decisions Eleanor and Robert had made had shaped the life Marcus had been able to build for his own family. Grandma Eleanor, tell me again about when Grandpa Robert decided to move to Phoenix, Sophia would request as they worked on puzzles together. Was Daddy scared to leave Boston? How did you know it would be good for our family? These conversations had allowed Eleanor to share family history and values in ways that felt natural and meaningful. She'd been able to tell Sophia about the importance of planning for the future, working as a team to overcome challenges, and maintaining family relationships even when circumstances changed. Dylan had been more active and impulsive, preferring activities that involved building, exploring, or physical challenges. Eleanor had enjoyed adapting her approach to match his energy level, taking him on walks through her neighborhood while teaching him to identify different plants and birds, or working on construction projects in her garage that satisfied his need for hands-on learning. Grandma Eleanor, can we build something new today? Dylan would ask the moment he arrived for their Sunday visits. I want to make something that Dad and Sophia will be surprised about. Eleanor had treasured these requests because they represented Dylan's association of her house with creativity, learning, and the freedom to pursue projects that interested him. She'd maintained a collection of building materials, art supplies, and educational games specifically for these visits, creating an environment where both children could explore their interests while receiving individual attention that wasn't possible during regular family time. But what had made these early years truly special wasn't just the individual relationships Eleanor had been building with Sophia and Dylan. It was the way Jessica had actively supported and encouraged those relationships while maintaining clear appreciation for Eleanor's role in the children's lives. The kids talk about you constantly, Jessica had told Eleanor after one of their Sunday visits. Sophia has been using techniques you taught her for managing her emotions when she gets frustrated with homework. And Dylan told his teacher that his grandmother taught him how to use tools safely when they were doing a building project at school. These reports had meant everything to Eleanor because they suggested that her influence on her grandchildren was extending beyond their time together into their daily lives and character development. She was contributing to their growth in ways that would shape them long-term, not just providing temporary entertainment or childcare convenience. Even more meaningful had been the way Jessica had begun, including Eleanor in decisions about the children's activities, education, and social development. Instead of treating Eleanor as someone who could be consulted when convenient, Jessica had positioned her as an integral part of the team that was responsible for raising Sophia and Dylan. Eleanor, what do you think about enrolling Sophia in piano lessons? Jessica had asked when Sophia was 4 years old. She's been showing a lot of interest in music, and I remember you mentioning that Marcus played piano when he was young. These conversations had felt like evidence that Jessica valued Eleanor's perspective and experience, not just her availability for practical help. Eleanor had been able to share insights about Marcus's childhood activities, what had worked well and what they might do differently, and how to balance structured activities with free play and family time. When Sophia had started kindergarten, Jessica had asked Eleanor to be involved in school activities and volunteer opportunities, treating her as an additional family resource rather than as someone whose involvement needed to be managed or limited. The school is looking for reading volunteers, Jessica had mentioned during one of their conversations. Sophia would be so excited if her grandmother could come to her classroom to read stories. Would you be interested in something like that, Eleanor? Had loved participating in Sophia's school community, and her involvement had been welcomed by teachers who appreciated having experienced volunteers who understood child development and classroom management. She'd become a regular reader during story time, had helped with school festivals and fundraisers, and had built relationships with other grandparents who were similarly involved in their grandchildren's education. These activities had made Eleanor feel like she was part of a larger community that valued intergenerational involvement, rather than seeing older adults as burdens or complications. She'd enjoyed the respect and appreciation she'd received from teachers, other parents, and community members who'd recognized her contributions to children's education and development. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of those early years had been the way Jessica had consistently acknowledged Eleanor's contributions in front of other people, treating her as a valued family member whose presence enhanced their lives rather than as someone whose help was simply expected or taken for granted. "We're so fortunate to have Eleanor so involved in the children's lives," Jessica would tell her friends when discussing childcare arrangements or family activities. "She brings so much wisdom and experience to their upbringing, and they absolutely adore spending time with her." At neighborhood gatherings and social events, Jessica had introduced Eleanor with genuine pride and appreciation, highlighting her role in the family in ways that made Eleanor feel valued and respected rather than merely tolerated. "This is Marcus's mother, Eleanor," Jessica would say when introducing her to new acquaintances. "She's been instrumental in helping us navigate parenthood, and Sophia and Dylan are so lucky to have such an involved grandmother." These introductions had meant more to Eleanor than Jessica probably realized, because they positioned her as someone whose presence was beneficial rather than burdensome, whose involvement was welcomed rather than endured. The financial arrangements during those early years had also reflected the kind of reciprocal family relationship that Eleanor had always hoped to maintain with Marcus and Jessica. Instead of Eleanor providing one-way financial support, while Marcus and Jessica offered only tolerance in return, there had been a genuine sense of mutual assistance and shared responsibility for family well-being. When Eleanor had sold her desert Bloom house after Robert's death and had given Marcus and Jessica $120,000 toward their mortgage, the transaction had been framed as an investment in their family's future rather than as Eleanor purchasing her place in their household. "This allows all of us to build something together," Marcus had said when discussing the financial arrangement. "You'll have security and proximity to family. We'll have the peace of mind that comes from knowing you're nearby and comfortable, and Sophia and Dylan will grow up with their grandmother as a central part of their daily lives." That framing had felt respectful and dignified, treating Eleanor's financial contribution as a gift that benefited everyone rather than as Eleanor paying for services or accommodation that she would receive from Marcus and Jessica. Similarly, Eleanor's ongoing financial contributions during those early years, helping with children's activities, contributing to vacation expenses, purchasing educational materials and equipment, had been received with gratitude and treated as generous choices rather than expected obligations. "Eleanor, you don't need to keep spending money on things for the kids," Jessica had said when Eleanor had purchased an expensive educational playground set for their backyard. "You've already been so generous with us." But Eleanor had enjoyed being able to contribute to Sophia and Dylan's opportunities and experiences, and Jessica's appreciation had made those contributions feel meaningful rather than simply expected. The transition from this golden period to the systematic marginalization that would eventually lead to Eleanor's abandonment at the shopping mall had been so gradual that Eleanor had initially missed the warning signs. But looking back now, she could identify the specific moment when everything had begun to change. Dylan's second birthday party had been the last time Eleanor could remember feeling truly welcomed and appreciated at a family celebration. Jessica had planned an elaborate party at their house with decorations, catered food, and invitations for extended family and friends. Eleanor had been included in the planning process, had been asked to help with setup and coordination, and had been introduced to guests as someone whose presence made the celebration more special. Dylan's grandmother has been such an important part of his life, Jessica had told guests during the party. He adores her, and we feel so fortunate to have her so involved in our family. But sometime during the months following that birthday party, Eleanor had begun to notice subtle shifts in how Jessica approached their relationship. The requests for advice had become less frequent and more perfunctory. The expressions of gratitude had started to feel automatic rather than genuine. The inclusion in family decisions had gradually diminished until Eleanor was being informed about plans rather than consulted about preferences. Most concerning of all, Jessica had begun making comments about Eleanor's living situation and future, needs that suggested she was already planning for changes to their current arrangement. "It's wonderful how independent you are at Sunset Gardens," Jessica had said during one of their conversations. "So many seniors struggle with the transition to community living, but you've really embraced all the opportunities for social activities and new friendships." At the time, Eleanor had interpreted these comments as appreciation for her successful adjustment to senior community living. But she could see now that Jessica had been laying the groundwork for suggesting that Eleanor's happiness at Sunset Gardens made her less dependent on family involvement, less needful of the close relationships that had characterized their bond during Sophia and Dylan's early years. The fracture to Eleanor's ankle 3 months ago, and her temporary need for wheelchair assistance during longer outings, had accelerated this transformation from appreciated family member to burdensome obligation. Instead of the accommodation and support Eleanor had provided during Jessica's own periods of need, Jessica had responded to Eleanor's temporary limitations with impatience and obvious resentment. "We'll have to see if restaurants can accommodate the wheelchair," Jessica would say when making dinner plans, as if Eleanor's mobility needs were complications to be managed rather than temporary challenges that deserved considerate response. "Maybe it would be easier if Eleanor stayed home this time," Jessica had begun suggesting when planning family activities, framing Eleanor's exclusion as consideration for her comfort rather than acknowledging it as elimination of inconvenience. For Jessica, the morning's abandonment at Westfield Shopping Center had been the inevitable culmination of this 3-year transformation from valued family member to discarded burden. Jessica had finally moved from subtle exclusion to overt cruelty, confident that Marcus would support her convenience over his mother's dignity. But what neither Jessica nor Marcus had anticipated was that the woman they'd been systematically marginalizing possessed resources and determination that could completely reverse the power dynamics in their relationship. The phone call Eleanor had made that Tuesday evening hadn't been a desperate plea for better treatment or a final attempt to negotiate for respect and consideration. It had been the first step in demonstrating exactly what life looked like when people lost access to benefits they'd been taking for granted. Within 48 hours, Marcus and Jessica would discover that the comfortable lifestyle they'd been assuming was permanent was actually dependent on maintaining respectful relationships with someone they'd been treating as disposable. The golden years of their financially secure, socially comfortable life were about to end, and the grandmother they'd left stranded in a wheelchair was about to become the most powerful person in their world. Eleanor Williams had spent 5 years giving Jessica and Marcus everything they needed to build the life of their dreams. Now, she was about to show them exactly what that life looked like when they lost her support. The mentorship phase was over. The reckoning was about to begin. Sometimes the people who mistake your generosity for weakness discover too late that you were actually choosing to be generous, and that you can choose to stop. Sometimes the family members who treat you as expendable learn that you were actually indispensable. And sometimes the best gift you can give people who take you for granted is the natural consequence of their own behavior. Eleanor's transformation from abandoned grandmother to powerful matriarch was about to change everything. Marcus and Jessica thought they knew about family, respect, and the price of treating people as disposable. The golden years were over, the reckoning had begun, and Eleanor Williams was about to remind her family exactly who held the real power in their comfortable, carefully constructed world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.